Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for making the time to be here. So today's talk is, as you can see there, is virtualization versus containerization. Just a quick brief on who I am. So I'm Umpile Matolani, all the way from South Africa. So basically worked in banking for, I guess, the entirety of my career. And basically my background is essentially driven from, how effective developers work and deliver, what they need to deliver. So I managed a couple of technical teams, and I guess the inspiration for this talk stems from, the inspiration of this talk basically just stems from not necessarily a technical aspect, but one of a cultural shift aspect, right? And ideally what I want to do in the session is that I want to, I guess, bring forward, the differences between the cultural shift that exists within virtualization versus the one that exists within containerization, right? So one of the key things that I think I want to kick off with is just understanding the landscape, right? And obviously we live in a world today where remote work and cloud-first, I guess, principles, govern how we deliver and how we operate within all our organizations. And people essentially want access to what, they need anywhere and anytime. And essentially, the basis of, I guess, what we are trying to solve for when we need to decide which type of technology we need to implement is that we need to get a better understanding of, the experiences that lie behind, the use of either, a VDI versus, a hybrid workspace that, is on cloud. And one of the key things that I want to highlight is that we are no longer just managing technology in the actual sense, right? We are actually managing digital experience fabrics, right? That, in my opinion, span between clouds, and devices and identities, and I guess we live in a world right now where connectivity tissues, span between security, productivity, and infrastructure, right? And one of the key things that I think we need to ask ourselves, or the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, what does it mean to actually deliver digital work, in today's world, right? And a huge part of it could then come from, whether you decide to use a cloud-hosted VDI, hybrid workspace, or containerized apps, right? For most people, they would argue differently to say that containerized apps essentially, I guess, deal more with how you deliver applications, whereas your virtualization, speaks more towards how you manage infrastructure, right? And for some people, those two worlds don't necessarily coincide or don't necessarily relate to one another. But I guess as we move throughout the entire talk, essentially we'll try to draw out, the parallels that would exist between the two worlds and what, the cultural shift that I mentioned earlier on could be adapted into, your way of actually deciding, the world that you want to live in, right? So maybe just throwing back into, the world that we come from. So we come from a world of virtualization, right? And essentially in that world, centralized control, consistent environments, and predictable performance was at the center of, IT departments and what they wanted to deliver. And, most IT departments, would be faced with like multiple, I guess, cases that they wanted to solve, whether it's them wanting to deploy, I guess, thousands of desktops, across multiple users, and their key concerns maybe at the point in time are security, compliance, or control. And I think at that point in time, what virtualization offered was that it offered us, that centralized control where governance and compliance was at the center of it, right? So instead of now managing multiple devices, you just have that central control panel that you can just use to govern all, these machines that you've deployed, right? And at the heart of virtualization, it offered us that stability that we so desperately needed in IT, right? But for me, that level of achievement or that success also brought a level of, I guess, it had its own limitations, right? And the limitations that it actually brought for many was that it brought, it had limited or hidden costs of control. And one of those, I guess, a multiple of those would be that centralization simplified management, but to a certain extent, it slowed down innovation, right? So you look at something as simple as deploying an update. You needed to have a maintenance window, or you needed to have like a CAD session just to, deploy an update. And it's that level of stability that came with it that, in a way, lessened the level of responsiveness that we had, And in that case, then innovation, to a certain extent, I guess, slowed down to a point where, for some, it became a limitation to them. Another case that I think that, was the hidden cost of that control that virtualization offered was that stability increased, but flexibility vanished to a certain extent. And you find that VDI environments were optimized for consistency and not experimentation. And, every change, within a VDI environment came with its own risks. And deviating from that, golden path that you've defined, had its own risks to a certain extent. Another of those, I guess, costs that came with, having this good level of control was that, control was scaled, but creativity didn't. So virtualization gave us a centralized power, but distributed dependencies. And we built essentially monolithic EUC stacks that were technically beautiful if you think about them, but organizationally they were, I guess, much more rigid, right? So one of the key things that then came into play, I think, over the years was then the idea or understanding that, containerization exists. And to a certain extent, people then understanding that, containerization then brought its own, I guess, philosophies, within technology, right? And one of those, philosophies that it brought was that as much as, virtualization was built for a world that valued consistency, we standardized images, built golden templates, enforced control, and everything in that sense was predictable but slow. And containerization in this instance valued velocity. And I think that's the key thing that I would say a lot of people should part ways with when they leave this talk, is that I've seen a lot of organizations, or rather vendors, come into your large organizations like banks and try to pitch maybe some sort of VDI, cloud-hosted VDI platform, but they tend to lose sight of the nuances that I may say govern how organizations operate today, right? And a lot of organizations operate with the mindset of delivering as fast as possible, right? So ideally, when you come into a space as a vendor to say that, listen, I'm selling this cloud-hosted VDI, the key thing that you need to take into account is velocity. And as much as we don't manage, images anymore, we need to now start managing intent. So as we build platforms that we want, we also need to take into account that automation can easily facilitate that velocity that we so desperately need or are yearning for within corporate organizations, right? So one of the key things that I think we need to understand as well is that containerization is not a new technology. It's just a way of thinking about ownership and change and delivery. And you'll see that most of my slides have like those, those parting words at the bottom. And essentially what we need to focus on is that just a change in mindset in terms of ownership, change in delivery. And one of the things that, ECU and I guess maybe virtualization needs to bring, right? And one of the key things that we need to focus on is that we need to focus on experience, right? So like you would imagine, and like I mentioned earlier on, virtualizations or ECU, traditional ECU, gives you that level of control, stability, and compliance. But then if you think about the world of containerization, which is heavily driven by DevOps principles, you start then to think about automation, agility, and speed, right? And if you merge those two worlds, in my opinion, you then now start to think about experience in its entirety, right? And I don't know if you've heard about everything as code or every experience as code. Essentially what that talks about is the ability for you to automate as much as possible, right? And at the center of it, as much as your core, I guess, output would be to deliver stable technology or platforms in which individuals or teams can work on, you also want to make sure that the experience behind that, it's front and center of everything that you do, right? So maybe just taking a look at why containers have basically just creeped into, the world of ECU. I think one of the key things that was a big driver for why containers, in my opinion, start making an impact into this world that we live in, was that there was a lot of business pressure, right? And a lot of the time, I guess, organizations wanted faster app delivery and updates for hybrid workspaces. And in the same breath as well, a lot of these organizations, what they wanted was that they want that level of, cloud alignment, right? And you find that most services or applications that are developed with a cloud native mindset at the forefront of it. And essentially what containers have done for us is that they've basically just merged that DevOps mindset or DevOps philosophy that drives, the continuous integration, continuous delivery of applications, of systems that, are delivered. And essentially that CI/CD and containerized registry somehow reshapes how, apps reach users at the end of the day. And I've seen a lot of vendors now, transitioning into that world now where, they want to start making use of, infrastructure as code, right? In instances where you find that you're able to just spin up a workspace or environment just from a Terraform script, right? And ideally, that's the world that we want to get to. We want to get to the world where you're able to just, start up an environment with just a, snap of a finger, and things are, ready for use, right? And vendors have, progressed into that world where you've seen Microsoft now offering dev boxes. You see AWS offering your, workspace core. So this is quite evident, and I guess maybe the fact that, a lot of these vendors have moved into this workspace, it's quite evident to the fact that, experience has now kind of reached, where it needs to reach to. And I guess that in this extent, they now understand that, it's quite important that you cater for today's world, right? So there's a lot of, differences that exist between virtualization and containerization, right? And I think at the core of it, when you speak about traditional virtual machines, there's certain things that we need to take into account, like your startup time, resource overload, overhead, your isolation, your management module, performance, user experience. So all these things obviously differ between whether you're using a virtualized environment or containerized applications, right? And I guess the differences between the two can simply be that, from containers to boot, it normally takes a matter of seconds. Whereas maybe for, your traditional VDI machines, that would take a couple of minutes for you to start up a VDI machine. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but at the end of it all, and I think as we transition into, the next coming slides, one of the things that I just want to highlight is, that key consideration that we all need to have. And one of the things that we also need to take into account is that as much as you're trying to make a decision between virtualization, containerization, or having some sort of hybrid model in between, it's not necessarily about choosing or picking which one is best for you, but rather just understanding the context and intent of what you are solving for. And I guess one of the key learnings that we've had over the years has been that, a lot of IT, custodians or vendors, normally when they come into organizations pitching for, the use of these certain technologies, they tend to lose sight of, the core I guess, foundational values that govern any organization, right? And those values for me, I guess culture, skill sets, and governance and automation, for me, that's the core of any organization. So it's quite important that before you even get into an organization and maybe pitch or decide on, what type of technology stack you want to make use of, it's quite important that you understand, that foundation, right? Because then oftentimes some of the lessons that have been learned, we've learned that, technical success doesn't necessarily equate to operational success. And a simple example of this would be that, maybe as a developer, you have some sort of deployment pipeline that, works beautifully on your local machine, but as soon as you put it into production, you have individuals that are more, I guess, focused on, change management, asking the question, who approved this deployment, or where's the rollback plan? So it's things like this that I guess make you wonder or think about the fact that as much as you celebrate success, to a certain extent, that success or that speed of success that you celebrate can bring a source of anxiety to certain individuals, right? Because as you think about the rate at which you're delivering something, you also want to have the surety that, every single thing that you do comes with a certain level of, I guess, change management in mind, right? Another, I guess, maybe lesson that has been learned in, or a typical example where you find technology outpacing process is that you find automation without governance becoming chaos. And, I've seen instances where containerized services or apps go down because maybe a developer at that point in time pushed something into production that wasn't necessarily tested thoroughly, or maybe wasn't version controlled correctly. And you find that the fix isn't necessarily to abandon automation in its entirety, but it is to govern automation to a certain extent. And in this case, you want to make sure that approvals, version control, rollback plans form part and parcel of your pipelines, and not necessarily like an afterthought. So in this, I guess, mindset, one of the key things that you want to do is that you want to make sure that as much as you're able to spin up certain environments, there is, to a certain extent, a level of governance that's also implemented or set in place in terms of, how you actually spin up those environments, whether it's automatic, whether it's manual, however the case may be. And one of, I guess, maybe the last ones that I think resonates quite well with me is that performance isn't measurable, but experience is, right? And when things break in production environments, and maybe there's a case where, the startup time is quite slow or logins are slow, users don't necessarily, I guess, care about the architecture, how marvelous your Terraform script was in terms of spinning up workspace. To them, all they care about is the fact that IT broke something and I'm unable to log in as quick as I wanted to, right? And at the base of it, or at the core of it, it shows that experience is everything that we need to consider when we actually think about technology and how we, deliver these technologies. So just in terms of like some sort of decisioning framework that I think should ideally be used for most people, especially, I guess, people in organizations that, try to decide, what to use in terms of, technology stack. This for me is just like a decisioning, I guess, diagram that I would use in terms of understanding where you sit in terms of legacy or modern, and also in terms of understanding how much freedom or governance your environment actually demands, right? And so that would basically be determined by, the level of control or agility that you want to achieve. So you find that in most cases, when you're working with your containerized applications, at the heart of it is agility, CI/CD delivery. And, if you're taking a look at the architecture stack that you want to work on, it's at that point in time probably much more modern. And the level of agility that you want to achieve is much more higher. Therefore, you'd probably want to go with containerized, technologies. In instances where you have like a merger of both, modern and somewhat, and you still want to retain that level of control that you want, then that's the case, then you'd probably want to make use of your hybrid API-led, I guess, infrastructure, right? That's probably governed by policy-managed container workloads, right? So this, for me, is just a basic, I guess, decisioning diagram that I would use in determining, what to go with. So just moving into the future of I guess, EUC, from infrastructure to experience delivery. I think one of the key things that has come to light is that, workspaces, I guess maybe workspace adoption is dynamic, and has become dynamic to a point of who you are, where you are, and who the user is, right? And in that sense, I guess then we could say that it's much more context aware. And another thing that maybe I would want to highlight in this case is that observability has shifted, from, caring much about uptime, but now you start caring more about response, latency, and satisfaction. So if you take a simple thing as, whether you're using a hybrid workspace or a cloud VDI, you're no longer just focused about just uptime at that point in time. You're just now focused on latency, right? So if you can't get to your workspace in the time frame that you want to, it becomes an inhibitor of how you want to experience, that specific workspace. And I guess with AI being, all over the place and most people talking about AI, we now need to start thinking about, how AI and policy orchestration have merged, and I guess to a certain extent the use of cloud technology, gives us that predictive scaling that is very much needed. We've also seen instances where self-healing and intent-based compliance is now, I guess, merging into this new way of utilizing infrastructure or workspaces that are deployed within organizations. So I did mention Microsoft DevBoxes earlier on. And, for me, this is a classic example of how teams nowadays want to operate, right? So like I mentioned earlier on, so I manage a team of developers. And I think having worked in a number of organizations in the banking space, one of the key things that I've seen is that you find that working with a lot of distributed, I guess, resources across, the world. I've worked with teams in India, teams in Poland, and a lot of the time, we've seen that, I guess, collaboration and just spinning up environments that can easily be used by anyone, anywhere around the world, has become much more easier with the use of, something as simple as Microsoft DevBoxes, right? And I think that's just a typical example of where the world is basically transitioning into, where you find that you're able to just spin up a workspace, for the duration of a project, right? And then once that project is done, or that resource is no longer allocated to that project, you just remove that specific allocation of that resource, and then just spin up another box, when, I guess, another project comes up. So I think the fact that we've slowly moved into this world, I think is something that, we ideally want to keep, the momentum on. And as much as, microservice DevBoxes, give us that virtualization base, I guess then at the core of it is that it's driven by those container principles that, like I mentioned earlier on, give us that experience as a code, as an outcome, right? Because if you think about how quick you can just spin up a Microsoft DevBox, it's testament to the fact that experience as code is now a thing that, governs all of us, right? So just taking a look at the journey so far. So the journey so far, basically, we've talked about virtualization and how it solved complexity through centralization. We've spoken about, I guess, containerization, and how it redefined delivery through abstraction. To a certain extent, we spoke about, I guess, EUC and DevOps and how, it's highlighted the cost of control. We also highlighted here and there about a hybrid reality that balanced, I guess the speed of delivery versus you still being able to be in control of your infrastructure. We've also highlighted or spoken about experience as code and the future of ECU, right? EUC. So I guess maybe key takeaways for me is that, virtualization optimizes control, consistency, and compliance, right? Like I mentioned, it's ideal for a much more stateful, GUI-heavy, or regulated workload. Whereas, opposing to that, containerization is much more ideal for like your stateless, API-driven, or cloud-native workloads. So a lot of the time that I think organizations need to move into, I think the sweet spot for me is much more your hybrid, I guess, workspace, right? Where you're able to, I guess, maybe overlay, your VDI infrastructure with containerized apps, right? And I think that balance gives you a good, balance basically in terms of control and velocity to a certain extent. And it's also, I guess, ideal for your incremental modernization, and also, I guess, ideal for also shared delivery. I guess key focuses, like I mentioned, for hybrid, and the reason why I would personally advocate for a much more hybrid model, like I mentioned, it's more like experience and adaptability, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, virtualization is something that should be frowned upon, but, we need to kind of like I mentioned, have a focus on that mindset of how quick are we able to deliver and innovate in everything that we do. So at the end of the day, I guess the parting words for this is not to necessarily chase, I guess, trends, but to architect for context and understand the nuances and core driving principles of any organization. And once you have that core understanding of what drives an organization, whether it's speed, innovation, it will then determine, the technology that you ideally want to make use within that organization. And that's it for me. Thank you for the time. That's my LinkedIn if you want to get in touch. Sure. Thank you, everyone.